So we now have Marcus Ferreira and Jim White and Jean Turner with us. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was what kind of impact urban restoration can have on large continental contiguities between habitat as we face global warming and migration issues and so on. And I had just said that Marcus and I just started working together because of a program with, I always forget what it is. Temple, somebody from Temple University who brought us together the way Jim and I got together way back when, that was 2007. Because Marcus has a huge restoration project there about trees, which interested me, and he's working with a very large community. And I got to attend one of his meetings last night. And I have to give a quick apology, especially to Jim, because the person who was working on the drone photography couldn't make it today. So I hope you're not devastatingly disappointed.
I'm good. I nothing could take me out of a good mood today. Nothing.
You and the rest of us. But if you want to show some of what you're doing with the drone work in the Arctic, that would be really great, because I think one of the big issues with large landscape restoration is what we can see from drone photography. So I'm going to invite Marcus to start us off by describing his project in Philadelphia. And if you don't mind also mentioning what you had in mind that you and I might work on with the Delaware River. And then let's go into a conversation about how effective this sort of thing can be.
Hello, everyone. Well, I want to say that I'm already in favor of this because you have a guitar behind you.
Oh.
Two guitars.
Two guitars, there you go.
One's actually a 5-string bass. Pretty neat.
That's even better.
Hi, my name is Marcus Ferreira. I'm a volunteer with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society Tree Tenders. I lead a local group for my neighborhood, which is 36 square blocks, but on a more macro scale. I'm the co-chair for the citywide committee of tree tender leaders. And we're working with the city to help reverse the canopy loss that we've been experiencing in the city, primarily on street trees. And then there's been loss where when development happens and we lose weed trees and lots, etc. So some of the canopy loss is less lamentable than others when we're losing polonias and ailanthus, etc. But so we were at 21% 10 years ago, and we went down to 20%, which is a 6% loss. And the goal for the city is to create a canopy of 30%. And what we're trying to do is work with the city to provide policy changes to help stem the loss, because maybe with the Biden administration, we'll get some more funding, but there's some things that we can do that we can protect the trees that we have, especially, and then get developers on board with planting trees as new development occurs, so that it's not all on the community, whether it's the Horticultural Society or the city planting new trees. So deforestation is not unique to Philadelphia. I just feel that our city, we've done a particularly poor job of retaining the trees that we have. New York, I believe, has a 29% canopy. DC is approximately 40%. And when you go to New York, you see whenever there's construction nearby, there's a frame around the critical root zone and the trunk. In Philadelphia, there's none of that. The trees just come down. So we're hoping to work on these systemic issues, and then just also to raise awareness of the importance of trees to the general population of Philadelphians, and then the construction industry, and also with utility contractors. And so one thought was with Aviva to try to create a sense of a heightened awareness of the value of trees, that they're not these inanimate objects like a rock, and to so that we can protect them moving forward, and establish a baseline. So when we plant, those saplings represent additions as opposed to trying to make up for losses when we lose larger canopy trees that were planted 30 years ago.
And Marcus, can you weave in where you feel the Delaware River fits into this plan?
Well, so the Philadelphia is situated, or a big part of it, on the Delaware River, and we are on the watershed. The Delaware River is unique in that it feeds, it's the source of water, or at least a partial source for New York and Philadelphia. It's the only river that is a source for two of the major cities in the country. And any tree planted in Philadelphia is going to have a positive impact on the health of the Delaware River, and with the exception of maybe an invasive tree, so with caveats. So no calorie pairs, but if we plant good canopy native trees, especially, it's going to help with the hydrology of the river, reduce stormwater overflow. So we have a combined stormwater system, and if we can increase the canopy, there will be more interception and filtration of rainwater, and to the benefit of the Delaware and the smaller Schuylkill River, which cuts between Center City and West Philadelphia.
So let me just add a little bit to this, and then I'd like to open it up to Janine. The work that Marcus just referred to, that he and I were talking about, was I had suggested that we do an installation of a spreadsheet, like maybe 40 feet long, that would show everything that goes into protecting one tree, and then all the benefits that accrue from protecting that one tree. So there could be just a little bit more education about what it means to reforest an area. Something that I hope we'll get to, Marcus, and maybe all of us could discuss, because I've been thinking about it, is the possible conflicts between looking at large landscapes as configurations of mosaics versus a more contiguous metaphorical experience of large landscapes. And this comes up all the time when I think about ecotones. And some recent research that I've been passing back and forth with Marcus has been about how urban systems modify the ecotones around trees, and make it harder to create the contiguity that interests me most. So that's just adding a little bit more information. One of the things I hope that Marcus and I can talk about is not just how we can spread the mosaics, but where could we find trigger points in the whole system, small points of intervention where we could leverage a lot for a little. So now that I've added all that, Jean, Jim, do you have something to say?
You're on mute, Gene.
This time, yes. Do you know Jonathan Sharp? Jonathan Sharp has done water quality in Delaware Bay for his whole career. And Delaware Bay had 0 oxygen content in 1880. And it went to about 75% oxygen concentration in the 1960s. And he's been studying, the condition of the Delaware Bay, and I've been up there many times. And he's a retired guy from the University of Delaware, but he's really sharp, he's interested in public stuff, and I'll be glad to forward his email address. And if there's water quality in Delaware connection is what I'm saying. And the Delaware Bay has recovered a significant part of its oxygen concentration bit by bit because of the constant, I'm not going to use the word interference, the constant attention of the EPA and other regulatory bodies. So that might be a help.
That sounds great. What about you, Jim? Where do you come in on the whole issue of reforesting and watershed protection as we deal with climate change and ecocide?
Oh, I'm a huge fan of trees. Marcus, for what it's worth, I wrote my PhD thesis on stable isotopes in trees. And so I traced water movement through trees and transpiration physics and a bunch of stuff. The background is that if you measure the ratio of heavy to light isotopes of water, it's related to temperature on a global scale. And so the question was, could we use trees as recorders of the past? And we did not understand very much about how trees worked. So we were able to look at things like, what roots were drawing water when, and the importance of the deeper roots, the importance of the shallow roots, et cetera, because you actually track how water goes into a tree. So I happen to be a huge fan of trees. So one of the questions I had about green spaces in cities, I'm very glad to be able to ask some of these questions. To what extent is it parks, and to what extent is it trees along boulevards? And are trees along boulevards a good idea for trees? And I always wondered about that when you're walking along. How if you're a tree, is it a nice place to be planted along a boulevard?
Absolutely not.
I didn't think so.
It's beneficial to the humans who live near these trees. So I live in Center City, Philadelphia. My block is fairly tree lined. There are other blocks that are not. And if you look at Wallerbein's research in Germany, he talks about how the mycorrhizal networks all interact. I doubt there's any mycorrhizal network interacting when there's utilities in the way, the truncated roots to get these trees into the pits to begin with. And quite frankly, the boulevards are the exception here. We're usually talking about 50-foot right-of-ways, where maybe 20 to 25 feet of that are sidewalks. And then the trees only get, at a minimum in Philadelphia, 9 square feet, 3 by 3. Yeah. And we try to push for bigger and bigger to increase the soil volume. But in general, in Philadelphia, 5 by 4, 20 square feet surface area is considered pretty generous.
But they do so many things.
Yeah.
I mean, they remove pollutants, they store carbon.
Yeah.
There are a connection people have, just like pets have, to nature. It's like, it's a no-brainer to me to plant some trees anywhere. You can plant them better places and better configurations, but I can't think of anything wrong with it, other than you run into it when you're drunk or something.
Where did that come from?
I mean, some urbanites who grew up without trees on their block resent the introduction. Often trees are associated with gentrification sometimes. So you have wealthier suburbanites moving into urban neighborhoods. They bring their leafy green sensibilities with them, plant trees, and then don't necessarily rake up the leaves. And then other issues, there's some of it which is myth, some of it's caused by undersized tree pits, which are trees cause uplifting of sidewalks, so they become tripping hazards. If you are less well off, the city, although the right of way is technically owned by the city, they put it on the landowner to, or the building owner to fix the sidewalk if the tree uplifts it. So it's, you don't really get the direct benefit of the tree as in the square footage of your property, but now you're on the hook to repair. And then
I know that when we plant trees around sidewalks, they put a little metal grid around it that, you know, it's the size of the tree when they plant it. It's not segmented, so you can take it out as it gets bigger. You know, it's ridiculous. It's as if the tree is never going to grow. And then I know from when I have a restoration class that around housing developments, the young girls have much better, I don't even like the word self-esteem, but they have better self-esteem. They have lower pregnancy rates. They have better grades in schools. They have more effective network just for having trees around a housing development. I mean, the numbers, that's, I think it was Kayan that did this a bunch of years ago, but there's a bunch of experiments about observations basically about housing developments with and without trees. It just does this background beneficial connection by osmosis that most people don't understand.
Yeah.
Just having some connect, you know, there's a lot less stress being around them. There's so many positive elements. They cool off the city. I mean, I'm all with you.
And you know, your point about, I hadn't thought about it in terms of pets, Gene, but yes, I mean, it's you know, trees, I think, bring something of the natural world to us and make a connection that I think is hugely valuable. You know, I feel very strongly that cities should have parks, lots of them, you know, small ones, big ones, all over the place. And because that's an opportunity for people. Yes, it's not a real ecosystem because it's, you know, fragmented, it's not connected to other parks, etc. But at least it's an opportunity for people to see something of nature, not the full glory of nature, but at least see something of nature.
And you can build parks. I know it's a little off the topic, but you can build parks that have kind of an exterior zone that allows people to get in without being too afraid to go deeper because they're worried about homeless people and drugs and all that. But you can allow that kind of largeness to have ways to get in deeper and deeper and see some of the things that you're mentioning without having to experience, you know, the full thing, at least to get part of it. That's the way they've done it in Chicago with Olmsted Park, I think it's called.
Uh-huh.
Mark,
you know,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
Go
Well,
ahead.
I was just to say, you know, one of the things that's always bothered me about the way that people treat nature is it's really exemplified, I think, in terms of how we treat parks and cities. I mean, that tends to be the first place that if there's any budget cut, you cut, you know, the maintenance of parks, and parks become, you know, places where you don't want to go after a while. It's sort of like a metaphor for how we, you know, treat nature in general and how we treat ecosystems in general.
Or if you have a space that's made into a park, it's the first thing they put an office building in for government. It's crazy.
Well, and they, you know, is what you were saying, Marcus, you know, they allow invasive species, weed species to move in, and they don't maintain it and they don't take care of it. And, you know, to me, it's you know, all these places are opportunities for actually to have nice, you know, interaction with nature. And that's the first place that we cut, it seems. I don't know. Maybe it's a third.
I have a question for Marcus. Can you bring us into some of the politics and negotiations around making larger pits and a little bit more space around the trees?
Yes. So what happens is I'll do an inspection when a homeowner requests a tree, and I do a site suitability analysis, and a lot of it has to do with, okay, how wide is the sidewalk? How much frontage of is there in Philadelphia? We typically have 16-foot row homes, and an average sidewalk is, say, 10 feet wide. So it's 16 by 10 to work with, and we have to put a minimum of a 3 foot by 3 foot pit. But then there's all these rules. Down the middle of the sidewalk, there must be a minimum of 36 inches to comply with ADA. So you need a straight shot down the middle. Often utility lines, so you have water, gas, and sometimes cable, BIOS. And if they happen to be spaced in a way where they're just every few feet apart, and then you throw in the stoop of a door and maybe a light fixture on the furnishing zone, the curb side, all of a sudden it seems like the opportunities have disappeared. And what the city has set down are rules where you can't do a cut of the edge of the pit if it's within 6 inches of a water line or 18 inches of a gas line. And with all these buffer zones, it's almost impossible to get a darn tree pit approved. And then when it is approved, it has to be a modest size. So 3 by 4 is probably the average in Philadelphia, 12 square feet, where when you go to New York and others, you see a lot of 7 by 11 pits. And then what happens is in New York, I've noticed a lot of times the utility outlets that go up to the sidewalk are incorporated within the pit. And my suspicion is up there, the cuts and the digs are generally done by paid professionals who, just like any other contractor, has insurance. But when we're dealing with planting a tree as a volunteer-led organization, the Horticultural Society, they don't want volunteers digging near a gas line. And so one of the policy thoughts that I have to propose is, hey, if we see that a gas line is near, and if that's what the primary concern is in not allowing for a larger pit, let's not plant that as volunteers, but pass that on to the city and have professional contractors do the cut and plant, and have those folks bonded and insured.
That makes sense. So is there resistance to that?
No, so far well, in the past there was, because the rules are the rules. I brought this up in a recent meeting where the director of the tree division of Parks and Rec was there. And it was a Zoom meeting, so I could see her nodding her head as though this made sense. So I think the thought has been, the seed has been planted, so to speak, and it's now we're currently working on our urban forest plan, and part of the plan is to reverse the canopy losses. And so I'm going to make my darndest case to make sure that these types of simple policy recommendations get into that document, and then they're actually heeded. As part of the problem is the utilities get protected. You know, the Philly PGW doesn't want to have to work near the trunk of a tree. So that's Philadelphia Gas Works.
So do you have a fellowship, a foundation for this, an administrative structure? Is it all volunteer? Is it, just a public, whoever shows up meeting? I mean, how does this work? So far?
Right, so far, what it is there are 3 primary, or 4 primary planters of trees in the city, groups. One is the city itself, Parks and Rec. Homeowners request trees. Parks and Rec has a budget. TD Bank gave $1 million grant, so they're planting trees around rec centers, etc. Then the number 2 source is what I represent as a volunteer, the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and they've been planting trees for decades, and I've been involved for the past 10 years. And what we do is a similar thing is when homeowners request through us, we plant, but then it's all volunteers who are doing the planting. With that said, the cuts are done by, for the pits, those are done by qualified contractors. And then there's homeowners who request trees, and as long as they or get approval from the city and then use a qualified contractor, they can buy their own tree and plant it. And one of the issues there is the city mandates that you have a minimum 2-inch caliper diameter at breast height tree, ball and burlap, and those typically cost about $500 or more to plant, $500 to $700. Where if they were allowed to do a smaller 25-gallon container tree, that could be hand planted, and you could do that for about $130 if you plant it yourself. So the city has created barriers for homeowners to just buy the tree, plant it, and we're the poorest of the 10 largest cities in the country. So we're not the poorest city in the country, but of the 10 biggest, we are the poorest.
And is this only downtown, or is it spread out through the outlying areas?
The city and the county are coextensive in Philadelphia, so it's also Philadelphia County. So what I'm talking about is the city/county of Philadelphia, and then the downtown or center city is the core, which has a population of about 100,000 when you compare the total population of 1.55 million.
The University of Pennsylvania is downtown, and I would imagine you'd have support for them, but maybe not.
I'm sorry, what was?
The University of Pennsylvania is downtown,
Yes.
and I imagine wouldn't they support all this?
Yes, so they're in West Philadelphia, but it's sort of considered greater center city. Yeah, they're a partner. There's a tree tender group that works in their area. It's called University City Green, UC Green, and they're one of the more renowned tree tender groups. They plant 50 to 100 trees every cycle, which is twice a year. I don't think UPenn donates directly. They might to PHS. They maintain their own trees on campus, and I'm sure that they have arrangements with the city as to street trees near their campus. But they're not a prominent player as far as trees in other neighborhoods.
And Temple is in Philadelphia, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So
So
they have
Temple.
a pretty strong environmental program.
Yes.
It seems to me that they would be welcome this as a student activity, for example.
Right. Yep. Philadelphia has numerous universities. There's Drexel, Temple, LaSalle. On the border, there's St. Joe's. There's a lot, the Community College of Philadelphia. So there's resources. I think each tends to be in its silo or worried about the immediate area around its campus. Each is dealing with angry neighbors who feel that students are gentrifying or crowding them out. They're dealing with their normal tensions. With that said, Austin, who's an artist at Temple's program, brought Aviva and I together. So yes, these universities do interact, but it's usually individual professors or students or programs that are doing individual projects. UPenn has the Morris Arboretum, and I believe Temple's has an arboretum, but it's in Ambler, which is outside the city.
I'd like to get some numbers. Can you tell me how many trees have been planted in the past 10 years? Can you tell me what the total number of volunteers is? And then I'm curious what the per capita ratio is of population to trees, to a tree. Average.
And then do you want that? So, I mean, this is stuff I wouldn't have on the top of my head.
Guess
I can guesstimate that PHS plants about 1,000 in the city per year. So it's 500 and 500 roughly. So that's 10,000. And those are street trees. Then the city itself plants a bunch, and then the Philadelphia Water Department, PWD, they plant their own as part of their negotiation with the EPA. So instead of the Water Department has negotiated, instead of building a lot of gray infrastructure, the idea was we'll do green stormwater management, which will cost us less. It'll filter the water better and create more holistic solutions. So they do a lot of planting, and most of the bioswales and bioretention stuff, that's coordinated by PWD.
that
So
sounds
I'm not
40,000 trees a year. Does that sound about right?
between the three. I'm not sure how much PDW or the city does, or individual homeowners or developers. So there's all these folks that are planting
Any idea what
independently.
the
And
mortality is?
what's that?
Do you have any idea what the mortality is?
The mortality rate is about, with the city and PHS, for the first 2 years, it's sort of like the initial quality report, about a 10% mortality, 5 to 10%.
It's actually better than I would have thought.
Yes. The PHS trees do well. They're a smaller caliper than the 2-inch desired by the tree, by the city. But we plant bare root, which I think are superior stock than ball and burlap, because they have the roots growing outwards already, and they tend to do a little bit better. And then we've been picking species that do well in our area. The honey locust is a great urban street tree. We've been reintroducing the elm, DED resistant elms. But over the long haul, I'm not sure, because I don't think there's data on how many big trees are just knocked down by a developer who says, I'm going to build a house, this tree's in my way, and it's coming down. And supposedly they're supposed to get a permit, but there's no penalty for not getting one, so they just do it.
And so what about the ratio of people to trees?
That I could get, at least with street trees, because what we have is 1.56 or so million people. And then I can look up the amount of street trees. I think it's north of 100,000, but I don't have that figure off the top of my head.
So
that actually caused me to look up on my phone how many trees there were in the U.S. And it's interesting. There's about in the neighborhood of 100 trees per person in the U.S.
That's not bad, actually.
Yeah, well, there's a lot. Where I live, there's a lot of trees.
So this is really a terrible parallel, but I have a urban forestry institute in our town that I do some work with. Not with trees, but that's their job, is to develop urban forestry, basically. They're one of the few ones. It's in Southern University.
Is it the Carey University or Carey Institute?
No, this is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Oh, okay.
I'm way away from you. But the thing is that the students are really enthusiastic about this. And I can imagine, I mean, it's independent of professors. And I can imagine that there are service groups or student groups that would catch on this. And, students groups, lose their enthusiasm and come back all the time about different subjects. But I think after this pandemic, they're going to be ripe for doing something, especially going back into the climate change. And what can they do? They're not going to go to Paris, but you can plant a tree. I mean, things like that. I think there's going to be ripe opportunities to have people involved that haven't been involved for a long time.
I have a question for all of you because Marcus and I have been tossing around this idea of a spreadsheet, a cost benefit spreadsheet for the past couple of days. How would you include some of this important information in a spreadsheet?
I don't quite understand you mean in a.
The idea is that people just take trees for granted and they're casual about them. They have no idea how complicated and difficult and detailed it is to grow one tree. And they feel resentful of the time that they put in and the expense. And they equally have even less understanding of all the benefits a tree can give.
So one example I like to tell people is that in a hospital that was in right angles rooms for gallbladder operations, one side of the right angle could see the tree, the other side could not. The people that had gallbladder operations, they could see the tree, got out a day or two earlier, they used less medicine, and they were in much better spirits. There are just really so many subtle things that happen from looking at trees. That just having them around you. If you put people under stress, they usually use students for these experiments because they're available, but you put people under stress and you have them go out in different places and you measure their blood pressure, their hormones and stuff like that. And they always come back better, quickly, faster when they're around trees. I think part of this is telling stories is what I'm coming down to. I don't know how.
I like that, Gene. I think I like that. I like your story and I think that's a good idea. I mean, I'm not sure how you would do it in a spreadsheet, but I like it.
Marcus, that was Daisy. Daisy is up in Maine and she is my assistant and she's making sure that everything goes smoothly.
Hopefully.
Yeah, one concern I have with the spreadsheet idea is if we focus and highlight the costs. Some people are very easily dissuaded and they'll kind of just shut down at that point. Where I think if we can really accentuate the benefits, that, hey, basically you plant this thing, the city or PHS will do it for you at no cost. The costs that PHS incurs is no consideration for the homeowner. All they have to do is agree to water and weed it for the first 2 years. Then after that, the roots establish, and then unless there's a drought, you don't really have to water it again. And in Philadelphia, we have a fair amount of rain, so it's after 2 years, it's almost maintenance free. Just mulch the thing, and then there is pruning that's involved, and PHS tree tenders are willing to do that for you for free for a while. After a while, then if they're canopy trees, they get too big for us. But yeah, I agree. There's a myriad of benefits. It goes down to, you could break it down for a commercial, like Main Streets. I live on South Street in Philadelphia, and our end is tree lined, and it makes it more pleasant for people to linger and spend more money. And there's studies that show that commercial corridors that are tree lined, people patronize the stores for longer, right? And shops. There's benefits that are not human or directly oriented, where if you plant natives, then you're going to attract wildlife. So whether it's I have a maple tree and I'm on the second floor. I watch the bees in the spring go by and just um, go through the tree. Like it's amazing. It's a procession. So it's, you know, it's a key, a cornerstone type of being that sustains the web of life. And so, yes, we can mechanistically for humans enumerate each thing: health, mental health, economics, stormwater interception. That's going to vary by species. So if you have a fastigiate cherry tree, it's not going to intercept nearly as much as a spreading elm tree that's much bigger and then also has a much bigger canopy spread.
But it might have a hawk in it with a
Right.
camera that people will love to see the hatchlings.
Yeah, I think there is a hawk cam near City Hall in Philly, and they do. The hawks take out the pigeons. It's kind of fun, and I believe there's a cam for it.
So
Good
just
for the hawk.
the cost benefit, I wasn't really thinking in terms of finances. I was thinking of the cost of labor, all the different kinds of labor that go into the care and feeding and nurturing of an individual tree, like pruning, for example. Just so that people are aware that it's not automatic. It's not something magical. People actually have to be committed and engaged, or a group of people have to be.
So I'm giving all kinds of gratuitous advice. I'm sorry. But we just did I found out through our mayor group that there's a coalition of small town mayors. Now our town is 400,000 people, so it's not that small. But they've circulated what our class wrote, which is a greening of the city. It's a, I don't know, 40, 70 page booklet. But there's lots of people that cities are recognizing, you know, there's health benefits like all the ones you know about, that they just don't know how to go about it. Which is, you know, what you're trying to figure out, I guess. I really hope, I wish you success because it's really ripe for doing. And there's lots of people that would do it if they just knew how or kind of had the time or money for it. So I'm really pleased with what you're saying.
Right.
You don't need my approval at all. I mean, I'm glad you're doing this.
Jean, it sounds like what you're suggesting is that there has to be some sort of a best practices manual for cities that want to reforest in some way.
It just small things would help. Everything from brochures to something thicker, you know, is brochures are done on a computer these days. Just we found that they get circulated pretty widely. You don't even know about them being circulated; they just get out. And there's always groups. There's in our place, there's Sierra Club and a couple of clean water groups that circulate those things for you. You know, maybe 20 members will show up and they'll grab 10, and all of a sudden you've got 200, you know, circulating. It's amazing.
Yeah, PHS does have a fact sheet for trees on the benefits, and it needs updating, but it gets the general gist.
But the thing is that volunteer groups often have more credibility than kind of an organized agency or a disorganized agency these days. So, you know.
Well, that's true that people actually trust local. They trust their neighbors more than they trust the government.
So here's another question for all of you. In my mission of forest and habitat contiguity, what role exactly can urban trees play in large landscape systems?
In large landscape systems, what you mean in large city landscape systems?
Say the whole Northeast or the whole
Oh.
Southwest. what can be the positive role in an ideal world of urban reforestation?
Well, the obvious positive role is it reminds people that, you know, the natural vegetation of this area is not concrete. And that's valuable. That's really valuable. And, you know, when people see squirrels or when they see birds, you know, there's a connection to nature that is really helpful, I think. And I think you know, the old idea of cities where they just mowed down all the vegetation and built stuff, you know, that creates, in my mind, a very sterile environment, and one that does, you know, and Jean knows all this, you know, the health benefits, the mental health benefits, all that stuff of having greenery around is real and it's tangible.
Yeah. Also, so I'll riff off that, which is I'm a believer of urban density as being one of the cogs in fighting the climate crisis. I don't think we can have 7.8 billion people living in McMansions. If we do that, there's not going to be any room for nature. And so we do need to make sure that the urban areas are attractive and inviting so that people do want to live here. And street trees, planter boxes, parks, you know, have a park within whatever your metric is, 5, 10, 15-minute walk of various sizes. You know, just make it a livable place, a welcoming and livable place to live where you do hear the birds. And, you know, here on my street, I only experience the English house sparrows. But one block over, which is a little bit more residential, we planted a crabapple, and my friend's an ornithologist, and he was, you know, praising the fact that it was attracting robins, and the robins are going crazy over the crabapples. So it does, trees do create a sense of connectedness to nature, but then also when you look at the true ecosystem, every city is near a water source. And so you have rivers like the Delaware, the Hudson in New York. Every city is near a water source. So, you know, these are, I believe, are, I'm not an ornithologist, but flyways for birds, and they need places to stop and get nutrients to continue on their journey. And my goal is to get as many trees as that are natives as possible to provide the birds with the nutrition to continue their migrations. So I don't know. So I think
colleagues down in Cape May that agree with you wholeheartedly. Cape May is a big spot for, you know, stopovers, and there's lots of ornithologists living there, and then they go there temporarily. Oof.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think also too, cities are, because they're situated by rivers, they're a big source of pollution, and this is a way to reduce the pollution on it loads on the rivers that they're abreast. So if we can reduce the amount of sewage flowing in because there are trees that are intercepting the rainwater into the Delaware from Philadelphia and Camden, then that's a huge win. Also air pollution, all this stuff. The urban heat island effect, if we can mitigate that, then there's less of a localized effect on climate change. Trees can also reduce ambient light escaping, which is harmful to wildlife. It's one of, I just read an article on how disruptive light pollution is to birds and other wildlife.
So it sounds to me that from an art point of view, what could help is some sort of a large landscape educational program, because it sounds like the education is extremely fragmented. There's a little bit of information and data here and there, but it's not coordinated at all.
Well, this is Daisy. I just wanted to say that I thought what you said, um, Marcus, was really interesting because I don't live in a big city, so I don't really think about it from that perspective.
What exactly, Daisy?
As far as like I didn't know about trees helping with light pollution or um, any of the things like as far as thinking about uh, making cities an enjoyable place to live. I just, because I live around trees, I don't think in that perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really liked that. I like hearing that.
Yeah, there's in Philadelphia, there's heat maps that show blocks that are within 3 or 4 blocks of each other. One has 40% or more canopy coverage, and the other one has 0%. And the temperature differentials on a hot summer day are something like 20 degrees. Yeah, if you get canopy coverage that shades the blacktop, you can make a tremendous difference on how the city feels.
So I saw last night that there are a lot of really interesting maps that people are putting together, but I think they are labor intensive for the ordinary person to understand and visualize. So it seems to me that one of the educational pieces to consider is how to map these relationships in ways that are really appealing and entertaining as well as informative.
So if I'm again being very, very gratuitous. If I were doing that, I would go to my landscape architecture department and say, here's your class project. Design, all these elements. We'll have people come in and tell you about some of them and design it for the city. And they will put it in the magazine section of the Sunday paper.
Great idea, Jean. Great idea.
And it's not a whole lot of work on our part.
You need somebody to work with GIS people too, so that it can be correlated.
All those students know how to do that stuff. I don't.
So what do you think, Marcus? We only have about 6 minutes left. I'm so glad you could have joined us today.
Yeah, thank you. I had no idea that my project was going to be like the highlight. It's awesome to have other eyes and expertise looking at this from different angles and different parts of the country. So I appreciate all your time with this and consideration. These are big issues. It's not just Philadelphia that's wrestling with them. Most cities are losing tree canopy. They're all trying to figure out ways to regrow it, reverse the trend. And it's big. And how do we do it? How do we communicate to people that this is something that's important, and it's not something that should be like a tiny fraction of the city budget. It should be part of, an important part of the budget.
So I want to ask Jim something. Remember a few years ago when we all did that Project Fish story, we calculated that we needed to regreen the earth by 36%. I'm not sure whether this is actually a question for Jim or for Marcus or for Jean. How could it change the ecosystem if the goal were not a 20% or 30% canopy, but a 36% canopy?
You lost me.
In other words, I want to push the envelope of what is ideal for replanting trees.
Oh. Well, I think, frankly, there's, other than the fact you've got buildings, right? So there's some limit to the percent canopy you can have. But I think that you should push it as far as you possibly can. I mean, I know that some European cities that I've been in must have canopy coverages of 50% or more. It seems that way when you walk around the streets. So.
DC is at 40%, and they're pushing to get up to 50%.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, I think like 36% is a nice metric, but already the plan for Philly is to go from 20 to 30, which is a 50% increase by 2030 or something. It's a huge push, and I forget why they chose that number. It's a round number, I guess. It does. If we're going to try to get 30%, 36% worldwide, is it realistic to expect 36% in major cities, or or do we expect 50% in the suburbs and then higher percentages elsewhere to get to a global 36%?
So one last question for Marcus or Jim, whoever knows about this. So the problem is the energy infrastructure that disrupts the vegetation. So what are the prospects in terms of what any of you know about research for the next 5 to 10 years that we could eliminate or severely reduce that infrastructure?
You mean the underground infrastructure?
Yes.
That's actually, Marcus, that's in your bailiwick, but I think that's probably the biggest problem you face is you can't plant trees everywhere. So
Right.
And also too, the above ground, because if what happens is the energy company comes and cuts and they do the hack jobs.
Yes, they cut the canopy in half, right? Yeah. See too much of that.
And basically what it does is in Center City, we have above or below ground for most of the streets. And then you go outside the core, and then one half of the street has the above ground. And then that restricts what types of trees we can plant, because we don't want those garish yews. So we end up planting crab apples, cherry trees, red buds, etc. And those trees that are on half the street are far less efficacious in doing creating the canopy that we want than we could do on the other half.
So does anybody know?
I mean, I gotta go. I'm sorry. So
thank you.
I knew you were going to do that.
Nice to meet you, Marcus.
I can't believe you stayed till 3:30.
Well, I'm late for my next Zoom
Bye,
meeting.
Jim.
What I do all day.
And I had
Bye.
a Zoom meeting too.
I know, all of us. So I have one last question before we all part, which is who's doing research on reducing either above ground or below ground infrastructures of this kind? Does anybody know?
No,
I
I gotta go. I left John Sharp's address in the chat box.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I'm gonna send other stuff to Aviva. She can pass on if she thinks it's appropriate.
That looks good.
See you.
Thank you.
Hi. Hi, Gene.
Very nice meeting you, Marcus.
As well. Thanks, Gene.